If you are a connoisseur of strange product origins, then you've likely heard the quirky and unlikely story of the Vibrators' creation, which goes something like this. During the Victorian era, women were regularly diagnosed with female hysteria, a catch-all condition covering everything from fainting, insomnia, irritability, nervousness, or excessive sexual desire, really any inconvenient symptom a woman could exhibit. The most popular treatment for female hysteria was the pelvic or clitoral massage performed by a doctor in a clinical setting. The completely ignorant of the female orgasm, doctors dismissed the resulting shudders and moans of ecstasy as mere paroxysms, maintaining that as no vaginal penetration was involved, pelvic massage had nothing to do with sex. As the popularity of this treatment exploded, doctors devised various mechanical vibrating machines to relieve their aching fingers and wrists, speed up the massage process, and allow them to service many more patients per day. And thus, an iconic sex toy was accidentally born. It is an entertaining story, one which has been told and retold in countless books, documentaries, and even scientific papers, and inspired several works of popular entertainment, including Sarah Ruhl's award-winning 2009 stage play In the Next Room, and the 2011 film Hysteria, starring Maggie Gyllenhaal and Jonathan Pryce. It is also completely false, without a shred of evidence backing any of it, something only extremely recently revealed. That's right, despite being widely reported as historical truth, the popular account of the Vibrators' creation is in fact a fantasy, concocted by a single historian based on dubious interpretations of historical records. Yet this narrative has remained largely unchallenged for more than 2 decades since, exposing worrying truths about how falsehoods can spread through popular culture and how academic research is fact-checked and published. This is the scandalous story of the Great Vibrator Myth. The popular tale of the Vibrators' unlikely origins first appeared in the 1999 book The Technology of Orgasm by American historian Rachel Maines. The book proved hugely popular upon its release and received multiple awards, including the American Historical Association's Herbert Weiss Prize for distinguished contributions to public history, as well as the American Foundation for Gender and Genital Medicine and Science, or AFG-GMS, Science and Biennial Book Awards. While controversial at first, Maine's conclusions have since become near universally accepted, being cited in dozens of academic papers and books, popular histories and sex manuals, and directly inspiring dramatic works like the aforementioned In the Next Room and Hysteria. Yet despite reviewers praising the book for opening up an entirely new area of historical inquiry, in the years following the Technology of Orgasm's publication, few researchers made any attempt to replicate or expand upon Maine's research. That is, until 2018, when Harley Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg, historians from the Georgia Institute of Technology, decided to examine the sources cited in Maine's book. As Lieberman's data stated, from what I knew of the history of sexuality, it sounded unlikely that doctors would be regularly performing pelvic massages. When I checked the sources, that was when I first really thought, okay, there's something up with this. End quote. What Lieberman and Schatzberg discovered was shocking. As they bluntly state in their 2018 paper, A Failure of Academic Quality Control, The Technology of Orgasm, published in the Journal of Positive Sexuality, we could find no evidence that physicians ever used electromechanical vibrators to induce orgasm in female patients as a medical treatment. We examined every source that Maines cites in support of her core claim. None of these sources actually do so. Maines provides remarkably few citations in support of them, instead padding her argument with a mass of tangential citations that obscure the lack of support for the core argument. But none of the sources she cites even suggest what she is arguing, at least not to a reader who is not already convinced that these practices occurred. But before we dive into Lieberman and Schatzberg's thorough debunking of Maine's conclusions, it's worth noting that one fundamental pillar of her argument is largely accurate. For thousands of years, physicians did indeed recognize an affliction called female hysteria. However, the definition and purported causes of this disorder have varied widely over the centuries. The term itself derives from the Greek hystera, meaning uterus or womb, and was originally associated with the ancient concept of the wandering womb. This is exactly what it sounds like, the belief that the uterus can randomly wander around a woman's body, putting pressure on various internal organs and causing all manner of health problems. This concept dates to at least the 15th century BCE, first appearing in the writings of ancient Greek physicians Hippocrates of Kos and Artaeus of Cappadocia. However, at the time, the term hysteria was not used, nor was the wandering womb theory universally accepted. Indeed, 3rd century CE Roman physician Claudius Galen attributed the condition to the so-called build-up of female seed, which grew sour and poisonous unless regularly expelled via sexual intercourse. Unwed women and widows were thought to be particularly vulnerable. Early treatments for female hysteria included, naturally, marriage, as well as burning sweet or foul-smelling herbs to draw or push push the uterus back to its natural position, once again proving that he was stupid. Following a brief period in the Middle Ages when hysteria was largely attributed to demonic possession, because I mean, sure, why not? The wandering room theory came back into vogue in the 16th century, along with a variation on the ancient theory of humorism. This held that all diseases were caused by an imbalance of 4 vital fluids, or humors: black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. As in the classical era, the most commonly prescribed treatment for a wandering or congested womb remained marriage and regular sexual intercourse with the sufferer's husband. By the 18th and 19th centuries, however, the wandering womb theory had been finally abandoned in favor of more scientific explanations. For example, German physician Anton Mesmer, a pioneer of hypnosis and the source of the term mesmerize, believed that hysteria was caused by a buildup of a type of energy that he called animal magnetism, and that this energy could be redirected using magnets or electrically charged metal rods. Meanwhile, French physician Joseph Raulin believed hysteria to be a vaporous ailment caused by air pollution in crowded urban areas. This was in keeping with contemporary miasma theory, which held that many diseases were caused by breathing in poisonous vapors, or miasmas. Indeed, the term malaria literally translates as bad air, reflecting the belief that the disease was caused by poisonous vapors emanating from swamps and marshes. Interestingly, Roland, along with many of his contemporaries, believed that both men and women could suffer from hysteria, but that women, being constitutionally weaker and lazier, were far more susceptible. I mean, the past, everybody. By this time, the diagnosis of hysteria had grown to encompass a dizzying variety of ailments, with French physician François Bossier de Sauvage de la Croix listing among the possible symptoms a swollen abdomen, suffocating angina, chest pain, or dyspnea, a shortness of breath, dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, cold extremities, tears and laughter, oscitation, that's yawning, pandiculation, that's stretching and yawning, delirium, a close and driving pulse, and abundant and clear urine. In the mid-19th century, hysteria came to be seen as more of a neurological or psychological disorder rather than a physiological one. French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot characterized hysteria as a form of epilepsy, and in the 1870s conducted extensive studies on hysteric patients at the Pitié-Salpêtrière Charity Hospital in Paris, capturing the various physical symptoms of the disorder in a series of widely published photographs. He also developed various hypnotic methods for treating hysteria based on the earlier work of Anton Mesmer. Others, however, took a decidedly more chauvinistic view of the disorder, with Harvard medical professor Edward Hammond Clark claiming in his 1875 treatise, Sex and Education, that modern food, clothing, and education drew energy away from women's reproductive organs, inflicting all manner of ailments. Clark argued that women be barred from higher education, lest it lead to, quote, physiological disasters such as nervous collapse and sterility. Others, like physician Frederick Hollick and psychiatrist Ellie Emerson, blamed hysteria on excessive sexual desire, promiscuity, masturbation, or sexual abuse in childhood. Treatments for hysteria also became more varied and extreme. For instance, in the 1850s, American physician Silas Weir Mitchell began prescribing the rest cure, which confined the patient to bed for weeks or even months on end. While this might not sound too bad, it is worth noting that patients were also forbidden from reading, writing, talking, or engaging their minds in any way, causing many to quickly and inexorably lose their sanity. Such was the case with American writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who, after being prescribed the rest cure by Dr. Mitchell himself, recounted her experiences in the classic 1892 horror short story, The Yellow Wallpaper. But it could always be worse. In extreme cases, women diagnosed with hysteria could be forcibly committed to psychiatric institutions and even subjected to surgical interventions, including hysterectomy and clitorectomy. And to learn more about the horrifying history of anti-masturbation measures and discover whether flicking the bean and flogging the dolphin actually does any harm, please do check out our previous video, Is Choking the Chicken Actually Bad for You? Yes, we covered that. Thankfully, advancements in psychiatry, along with the early feminist movement, eventually caused female hysteria to fall out of fashion as a legitimate medical diagnosis. However, as late as 1968, the condition was still included in the second edition of the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, aka the DSM-2. It would not be removed until the publication of DSM-3 in 1980. It is here, however, where actual medical history and the narrative presented in The Technology of Orgasm part ways. In their 2018 paper, Harley Lieberman and Eric Schatzberg break down Maine's thesis into 3 main arguments before debunking each in turn. These are A. Pelvic massages were a long-established and widely practiced treatment for female hysteria. B. Victorian doctors were unaware of the female orgasm or the role of the clitoris, and thus considered pelvic massage non-sexual since it involved no penetration. And C. The mechanical vibrator was developed specifically to make pelvic massage easier and more efficient. As noted, in each case, Lieberman and Schatzberg found shockingly little hard evidence for Mains's claims, writing that, quote, if vibrating the clitoris were indeed a standard medical therapy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, one would expect direct historical evidence of the practice either from proponents or critics. Medical discourse at the time was very contentious. Physicians regularly lauded and attacked therapies and used new technologies, especially electrical devices, so historians would expect to find debates about clitoral vibration in medical journals. Vibrators were widely promoted for other medical therapies in this era. The American Medical Association, in fact, was quite critical of such vibrator treatments. Furthermore, any medical procedure that could have been perceived as sexual would surely have attracted the attention of censorious moralists. Yet Mains insists that these treatments were not seen as sexual, so according to her own logic, physicians would have no reason to conceal the practice. Sometimes absence of evidence is really evidence of absence. The quote ends. And Lieberman and Schatzberg are far from being alone in their criticism. Previously, classical historian Helen King of the Open University London questioned the claim that pelvic massage was a long-established treatment for hysteria, arguing that Mains had cherry-picked and misinterpreted many of her sources, quoting her here. Mains wants a line of history going all the way back to the time of Hippocrates, so she was determined to find doctors massaging their female patients to orgasm in the earliest written sources. But a Roman satire describing anointers at the baths who masturbate a woman to orgasm is very different from saying doctors really did this. It's a satire. It's supposed to be outrageous. Mains also does this by reading a description about what happens when the womb is rubbed during intercourse and making that into a passage about masturbation by a doctor. End quote. Similarly, many sources which purportedly demonstrate the ubiquity of pelvic massage in the 18th and 19th centuries actually describe very different therapies. Quote, medical sources that describe pelvic and gynecological massage in detail show that the practice was not sexual, did not involve the clitoris, and did not produce an orgasm. The term pelvic massage usually meant uterine massage, a treatment frequently used for conditions such as dysmenorrhea or uterine prolapse. Furthermore, none of her English language sources even mentions production of paroxysms by massage or anything else that could remotely suggest an orgasm. This lack of evidence by itself undermines the core of her claim. Okay, going back to Lieberman and Schatzberg, they note multiple instances where Mains distorts or misinterprets her sources in service of her narrative, quoting them again. Mains's second key claim is that genital use of vibrators was a standard treatment for hysteria and related ailments such as neurasthenia. The sources she cites contradict this claim. Some of her cited sources do not even mention hysteria, while most of her sources on hysteria do not mention vibrators. Even when medical sources did endorse vibration treatment for hysteria, it was rarely a primary treatment and never recommended for application to the vulva. In one example, Mains twists a quote to make it seem to support her claim about clitoral massage for hysteria. In 1903, Samuel Howard Monell effectively summarized the demand of physicians since Hippocrates for some simple means of getting results with their hysterical patients. Pelvic massage in gynecology has its brilliant advocates, and they report wonderful results. But when practitioners must apply the skilled technique with their own fingers, the method has no value to the majority. For physicians in this line of work, the vibrator was a godsend. Special applicators, motor-driven, give practical value and office convenience of what otherwise is impractical. Now, on its face, this quote seems to be strong evidence. However, the context of the quote shows otherwise. In fact, the quote passage occurs in a discussion of massage for fractures, dislocations, and sprains. Even more questionable is Mains's claim that Victorian doctors viewed clitoral massage as non-sexual and thus unproblematic. By the 16th century, when marriage and regular intercourse were commonly prescribed to release built-up female seed, physicians such as Pieter van Forest and Giannini Betteo de Grado vigorously opposed any substitute procedure, such as the manual manipulation of the genitals by either the patient or the doctor. Such manipulation was seen as explicitly sexual and only recommended as a last resort, and even then, it was only performed by female midwives, not male doctors. Thus, the claim that Victorian doctors 300 years later would be unaware of the sexual nature of clitoral massage is patently absurd. In The Technology of Orgasm, Mains herself even states that, quote, Theodore Thomas, for example, wrote in 1891 that the purpose of the clitoris was to furnish to the female the nervous erythema euphemism, which is necessary to perfect a performance and completion of the sexual act, and went on to observe that orgasm could be produced by clitoral stimulation outside of intercourse. Indeed, that vibrators could be used for sexual stimulation was well understood by contemporary doctors like the amusingly named American gynecologist James Craven Wood. He's craving that word! Who wrote in 1917. Craven Wood! The greatest objection to vibration thus applied is that in overly sensitive patients, it is liable to cause sexual excitement. But if the vibratode is kept well back from the clitoris, there is but little danger of causing such excitement. Harley Lieberman further drives home the absurdity of Mains's claims in a 2020 New York Times article, writing that, imagine arguing that at the turn of the 20th century, female nurses were giving handjobs to male patients to treat them for psychological problems, that men didn't realize anything sexual was going on, that because female nurses' wrists got tired from all the handjobs, they invented a device called a penis pump to help speed up the process. Then imagine claiming nobody thought any of this was sexual because it was a century ago. On this note, in The Technology of Orgasm, Mains outlines a second major claim by stating, the androcentric definition of sex as an activity recognizes three essential steps: preparation for penetration, foreplay, penetration, and male orgasm. Sexual activity that does not involve at least the last two has not been popularly or medically, and for that matter legally, regarded as the real thing since no penetration was involved. Believers in the hypothesis that only penetration was sexually gratifying to women could argue that nothing sexual could be occurring when their patients experienced the hysterical paroxysm during treatment. End quote. In reality, as Lieberman and Schatzberg point out, the historical evidence demonstrates that penetrative use of vibrators was actually a standard medical practice. Most vibrator companies produced penetrative vaginal attachments, and nearly every vibrator sold to physicians included these. Ironically, when Mains argues that massage with vibrators only occurred on the vulva, her sources demonstrate the opposite point. They show that massage occurred inside the vagina. Furthermore, of the sources Mains cites in support of this claim, only one explicitly recommended using electrotherapeutic devices on the vulva, a 1909 book by female physician May Cushman Rice. However, Rice was not referring to treatment hysteria, but rather to the use of high-frequency electrodes to treat vulvitis, inflammation of the vulva. A few pages later, she suggested treating vaginismus, vaginal muscular spasms, by applying internal vaginal electrodes. Again, Rice never mentioned hysteria or hinted at anything that could be interpreted as sexual stimulation. As with the other sources we discuss, Rice's work lends no support to Mains's core claims. If, as Mains claims, Victorian doctors saw vaginal penetration as a prerequisite for sexual activity, then such attachments would not have been so widely and openly used. That they were, however, strongly suggests that this claim is false, and to learn more about the late 19th, early 20th century fad of electrotherapy and the weird and wonderful devices used to administer this treatment, please check out the video on the subject over on Our Own Devices, the personal channel of the author of this video, Gilles Messier. In the end, Lieberman and Schatzberg's paper completely demolishes every major argument made in The Technology of Orgasm. Not only did clitoral massage for the treatment of hysteria not have an extensive history stretching back to antiquity, but it was rarely, if at all, practiced even in the Victorian era. And while vibrators were widely used in Victorian medicine, they were not invented to increase the efficiency of clitoral massage, being used instead to treat other gynecological ailments. Thus, the amusing and scandalous story of the vibrator's creation is just that: it's a story, pieced together from carefully cherry-picked and conveniently misinterpreted sources. It is, in other words, seemingly a work of academic fraud. More on what Mains herself has to say about this in a bit. But what then is the real story? How did the ubiquitous sex toy we know and love today actually come to be? Well, most sources which follow Rachel Mains' narrative credit the invention of the electric vibrator to British physician Joseph Mortimer Granville. In the 2011 film Hysteria, Granville, played by actor Hugh Dancy, is shown creating the device to more efficiently service his patients and later becoming hugely wealthy off his invention. But while Joseph Granville was a real person and did indeed invent an electric vibrator in the 1880s, he did not use his device for the treatment of hysteria. In fact, explicitly warning against this application. Rather, he used it almost exclusively on men to treat a wide variety of ailments from chronic pain to deafness. The only sexually related application mentioned in any of his writings is stimulation of the perineum, the area between the genitals and the anus, to treat male impotence. Further, according to Mains's narrative, the legitimate medical use of these devices provided vibrator manufacturers with a plausible cover under which to market their wares. As Lieberman and Schatzberg explain, Mains argues that the electromechanical vibrator was able to become a mainstream consumer appliance in the early 1900s because it was considered to be a medical device, not a sexual one. The vibrator's sexual use remained hidden for over 2 decades, until the late 1920s when stag films began showing women using vibrators for sexual pleasure. As a consequence, vibrators lost their social camouflage as a home and professional medical instrument. Doctors stopped using them in their practice, and mainstream companies stopped marketing them. The truth, however, is much more nuanced. When the first mechanical vibrators were introduced in the 1880s, they were touted as a miraculous technology panacea capable of treating hundreds of ailments including insomnia, paralysis, neuralgia, epilepsy, tuberculosis, sciatica, lumbago, gout, deafness, vomiting, constipation, impotence, hemorrhoids, and even wrinkles. They remained popular with all manner of medical practitioners until 1915, when the American Medical Association issued a public statement declaring vibrators marketed for medical use to be a delusion and a snare. Faced with the collapse of the lucrative medical market, vibrator manufacturers pivoted to selling their wares directly to the public. Early 20th century newspapers and magazines were packed with ads for personal vibrators of all shapes and sizes. At the time, obscenity laws, such as the 1873 Comstock Act, forbade manufacturers from advertising sexually related products, forcing them to focus instead on the health and lifestyle benefits of their wares. Early vibrator advertisements often featured glamorous-looking women massaging themselves in bed or in the bath, with the ad copy for the Arnold vibrator promising, "Every woman can have a faultless complexion and youthful, finely proportioned figure. There is no need of powder, paints, pads, or other deceptions." And while many of these products were sold with dildo-like attachments, they were strictly marketed for treating uterine complaints and other non-sexual issues. However, as time went on, manufacturers grew more and more explicit in their marketing, filling their advertisements with images of shirtless men and women in low-cut tops with coy taglines like, "Invented by a woman who knows a woman's needs." Of course, physicians and moral guardians were perfectly aware of what these products were being used for behind closed doors, with one 1912 men's advice book warning that, quote, "Various electric vibrators have been abused by the unscrupulous to give vibratory massage of the generative organs, a sensation similar to that of masturbation." But thanks to the narrow tightrope of plausible deniability vibrator manufacturers managed to walk, there was nothing the prudes could do to stop this illicit trade. Indeed, when in the 1950s the US Food and Drug Administration launched a major campaign against personal vibrators, their concerns had nothing to do with masturbation. Rather, they sought to crack down on the outlandish and unsubstantiated health benefits still being claimed by vibrator manufacturers. But thanks to obscenity laws and conservative social attitudes, it was not until the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s that women began to talk more freely about masturbation and vibrators. In the late 1960s, New York sex educator and artist Betty Dodson began hosting women-only masturbation workshops to help women regain the sexual knowledge long denied them by society, writing in 1974 that, "I have found that the vibrator gives me the strongest and most consistent form of stimulation and is especially good for women who have never experienced orgasm." One of the vibrators used in Dodson's workshops, the Hitachi Magic Wand, went on to become one of the most recognizable and popular sex toys in the world, being ranked the #1 greatest gadget of all time by Mobile magazine in 2005. Today, the discerning consumer can choose from thousands of exotic and sophisticated vibrators to suit any taste, from internally inserted love eggs and pocket-sized bullets to larger, more elaborate models like the Rabbit, with attachments for both vaginal and clitoral stimulation. Many models feature wireless or USB charging, different vibration intensities and rhythms, and can even be synced to a user's favorite songs, including, of course, good vibrations. But in many parts of the world, including the United States, social progress has lagged far behind technological progress. For instance, several US states, including Texas, Louisiana, and Alabama, both have obscene devices laws, prohibiting devices designed or marketed as useful primarily for the stimulation of human genital organs, carrying penalties of up to $10,000 and a year in jail. Vibrators also remain illegal in many nations, including the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Malaysia, India, and Vietnam. For this reason, manufacturers carry on the age-old tradition of marketing their products as personal massagers. Getting back to the main subject of this video though, given how radically the real history of the vibrator deviates from the narrative presented in the technology of orgasm, why did it take nearly 2 decades for anyone to scrutinize and debunk Rachel Mains's claims? In the conclusion of the 2018 paper, Lieberman and Schatzberg attempt to give an explanation. Quoting them here, "Our answer to this question must be somewhat speculative. Fundamental to its reception is the book's sex appeal. It tells a scandalous story of transgressed boundaries, of dim-witted doctors providing women with sexual satisfaction. Mains has historicized the doctor-patient fantasy, a staple of erotica. Yet, unlike the porn fantasy, Mains' narrative can be discussed without social reproach because of its academic respectability. Yet the book's appeal isn't just sexual. Mains' story fits narratives of progress in sexual knowledge, allowing readers to see themselves as worldly sophisticates in contrast to the clueless, desexualized Victorians. Physicians look particularly ignorant in this account, having no clue what the clitoris is, let alone an orgasm. Mains also portrays women as victims of profit-hungry physicians. Such victim narratives were a staple of feminist critiques of medical care in the 1970s. Women have no real agency in Mains' account, as the historical actors are all male physicians, and women's voices are completely absent. However, readers can still view the female patients as heroes who subvert patriarchy by procuring orgasms under the guise of medical treatment. The story is thus paradoxical. Women are victims, but the tools used to victimize them bring them orgasms. A delicious irony. The quote ends. The salacious allure of Mains' narrative is seconded by Helen King, who writes, quote, "That story just appeals to people now. It's like some porn movie scenario with the doctor that, nudge nudge, knows what the problem really is." In other words, Mains' narrative was just too good to not be true, so people ate it up. But the general public falling for an entertaining story, that's one thing. The fact that it took nearly 20 years for any scholars to fact-check the book speaks to deeper issues within the field of academic history. As Lieberman and Schatzberg argue, quote, "The success of technology of orgasm thus serves as a cautionary tale for how easily falsehoods can become embedded in qualitative fields." The success of her book suggests that academics rarely check each other's facts carefully, especially when repeating stories that they want to be true. Indeed, we believe that the technology of orgasm is not an isolated case. The same pressures to publish that produced flawed research in the natural sciences and quantitative social sciences also exist in the humanities and qualitative social sciences. In the humanities and qualitative social sciences, these pressures encourage narrow, banal, and irrelevant research, often disguised by horrid prose and vapid theorizing. There are few safeguards against flawed empirical research in the humanities. Scholarly publishing rarely involves any sort of fact-checking. Peer reviewers and readers for academic presses are not expected to confirm a manuscript's empirical claims beyond what they already know. Book reviewers likewise rarely examine citations or sources. Far more fact-checking occurs in a typical magazine article than in a scholarly publication, despite complaints from journalists about a decline in the practice. Because fact-checking is not a routine practice in scholarly publication, factual challenges to scholarship, particularly in the field of history, are rare and can be perceived as personal attacks rather than part of the scholarly process. Unless a spirit of fact-checking and fearless critique is built into the culture of scholarly publishing, false history narratives like Mains's will continue to be published and even praised. The quote ends. In many ways, the unchallenged publication of the technology of orgasm resembles an inadvertent version of the Sakal affair, an infamous scholarly hoax which similarly revealed a disturbing lack of academic rigor in the humanities. In 1996, Alan Sokal, a professor of physics at New York University and University College London, submitted a deliberately nonsensical academic paper to the journal Social Text to find out whether, quote, "a leading North American journal of cultural studies would publish an article liberally salted with nonsense if it A, sounded good, and B, it flattered the editor's ideological preconceptions." As expected, the paper titled Transgressing the Boundaries Towards a Transformative Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity was not subjected to peer review by an expert and duly appeared in the journal's spring/summer issue. 3 weeks later, Sokal published an article in the magazine Lingua Franca revealing the paper to be a hoax, causing much embarrassment and controversy. And speaking of embarrassment, in response to Lieberman and Schatzberg's paper, Rachel Mains expressed surprise that it took 20 years for someone to challenge her claims, stating in an interview with The Atlantic that, quote, "What I said was that this was an interesting hypothesis, and as Lieberman points out, correctly I think, people fell all over it. It was ripe to be turned into mythology somehow. I didn't intend it that way, but boy, people sure took it and ran with it." But Lieberman, Schatzberg, and other critics have rebutted this excuse, citing the definitive language used in the technology of orgasm as evidence that Mains intended her conclusions to be more than just an interesting hypothesis.